All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our virtual book launch, where we'll be going through Varnish 6 by example, our newest book covering all things Varnish. So let's get started. Before I go in and introduce today's speakers, please note that this session is being recorded and we'll make it available to everyone after. You can ask questions throughout. We actually encourage it because we have our author here today. So please do ask questions throughout using either the Q&A panel on your screen, or you can simply raise your hand and we'll call on you to ask your questions live. So to get started, I'm Alex. I'm the US Marketing Manager here at Varnish, and I'll be helping Thijs today with the moderation. I'm also very pleased to introduce Thijs, who is not only the author, but product evangelist here at Varnish. So Thijs, if you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself and kind of tell us a little bit about the process of writing this book.
Yes, I'd be happy to. But first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone here who took the time to be here with us. Normally, we would organize an actual launch party with people in a room and drinks and that kind of stuff. That's obviously not happening today. So this is the next best thing. So thank you. I know you have options. I know there's plenty to do out there in terms of webinars. So I'm happy you're joining us here. I'm a tech evangelist. I've been working with Varnish for a couple of years now, but I've been a long time Varnish user, sort of end user. And I hope you can relate to that. I'm assuming that most of you are users as well. Now, writing the book, that was quite the adventure. Now, it wasn't my first book. Prior to joining Varnish Software, I already wrote a book about a very old version of Varnish that we no longer support. So when I joined, it was immediately clear that we had to come up with something new, something with that supports the current version, which is Varnish 6. And I started writing, and it was a very, very interesting process, I must admit. So I have a slide here with the process. So I reflected on the process, and I wrote this book as if I would write software. So it was using Git version control, and I wrote it in Markdown, and I used build tools to create a manuscript. And when I look at my Git comments, the first attempts on dabbling around with the book date back to January 2020. Now, we all remember January 2020. Our lives were completely different. Like we all had ambitions and plans, and everything was fine. So I started structuring content and traveling to the various offices in London and Oslo to meet with people and to make sure that we have like a good table of content. And that took me into March 2020. And we all know what happened in March 2020. So I started writing in April 2020 because I was locked down at home in this very office that you're currently seeing in the camera. I haven't been elsewhere ever since. And I started writing April 2020, and I ended March 10th, 2021. Meanwhile, as you can see in the slides, reviews happen in parallel. So I took my entire book, divided into chapters, and every chapter had sections, and every section was like an issue in GitHub that needed moderation, needed reviewing. And in the end, it happened in parallel. And then we reviewed it all the way to April 26, 2021. And it has been available. You could, if you haven't got it, you could still go to our website and sign up for it since April 27th. Now, the most interesting thing is that yesterday, I gave the okay to the publisher to go for print. So that happened yesterday. Now, but I would like to take you back to March 10th of this year, when this is an Instagram post I made. And as you can see, I'm actually using the Markdown syntax to create the manuscript. I'm talking about what a hell of a ride it was, and that it really took a pandemic to stay focused like that. And here I was thinking I wrote a 500-page book, which is quite excessive. But that was the manuscript. Once it went into the layout, we ended up with a book of 778 pages. So as mentioned, quite the adventure. So I could go on and on about the process, but I think most of you are interested in what we have to say in terms of content.
Yeah, and it definitely was quite the process to put together. So
can I add one more thing,
sure.
Alexander? I didn't write this on my own. I am the one who typed it all up, but it was a team effort. And I think I've got help from 29 people in the process, from marketeers to management to R&D people consulting me on the various specialties they have, and also in the review process. So 29 people, and every single one of them who was involved is mentioned in the book in one of the last pages.
Perfect. So definitely a team effort and a team of experts on Varnish. So Very good. We do have, like I mentioned, we had a couple of questions come in prior to the webinar that we wanted to kind of put in as they fit as we go through everything. So the first one that I have for you, Thijs, is this book is rather long, as you mentioned. It's a bit daunting for someone who's just getting started. So where do you suggest someone starts?
Well, I'm going to give you the obvious answer at the beginning, at chapter 1. But of course, maybe some people are in a hurry or aren't that patient. And as you'll see throughout this launch event, every single chapter has a reason, and there's a reason why chapter 1 talks about A and chapter 2 talks about B. But I would say if you are if you have zero experience with Varnish, please start at the beginning, because in chapter 1, I explain what Varnish is and in a bit of detail. And in chapter 2, I explain why you should consider Varnish 6, because that's also very, very important. Please stay away from old versions. But if you're relatively familiar with Varnish, I would say if you want the educational aspect, go to chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3, which we will discuss, I guess, later on, is about how HTTP can be used and the conventions of HTTP to trigger caching behavior. And chapter 4 is how you can use VCL. Those are good ones. If you want to go beyond the basics, chapter 5 is a place where you can learn about the rich ecosystem of modules. So that's a good one. And in chapter 6, I'm talking about how to invalidate the cache. So that's a good one if you want to get started. Now, I'm also focusing on specific target audiences. So who is brave enough to operate Varnish, who has been given the responsibility to operate Varnish. You want to learn about the operational aspect. And I actually wrote an entire chapter about that. So if you're an ops person, chapter 7 is your chapter. If you are a very advanced Varnish user and you want to start caching and cacheable stuff, chapter 8 is your thing. And we'll get to there. I think I'm skipping ahead, but this all culminates into chapter 9, where we talk about how to build a full-blown content delivery solution. So it depends on your skill level and the industry you operate in. But if you are patient and you have the time and you are interested, please start at the beginning.
Perfect. All right, well, with that being said, let's actually dive into the book now. So like you mentioned, this is the newest book. There was an older book that's a couple of years old now. So there have been quite a few changes from the last book, especially in chapter 1 and 2. Can you kind of talk us through what those major changes are in those first 2 chapters?
Well, of course, a lot has changed in terms of functionality. We don't call it Varnish 6. We don't give it a new major version number unless there's breaking things, things that are significant enough to communicate about. Now, what people need to know about Varnish is it is on a 6-month release schedule. So that means regardless of if there's anything new to announce, there's a release happening March 15th and September 15th every single year. And we bump up the versions, the minor versions, but at some point you're going to reach a breaking point, and that's where the major releases come in. So Varnish 6 has 2 significant features, if you ask me. There's a bunch of features, but Varnish 6 has a major breaking change, and I will take you through that, is the fact that Unix domain sockets are supported. So that means you no longer are exclusively connecting over TCP/IP. You can use incoming connections over Unix domain sockets, which may reduce the overhead. And you can also transition from using TCP/IP in your VCL code for connecting to an origin over Unix domain sockets. And that is in fact a big change. And that's why this is Varnish 6 and not Varnish 5 point whatever. And that's also why you see on this very slide that we bumped up the VCL syntax. So for a long time, we've been using Varnish VCL version 4.0, which is still compatible in version 6. But if you want to use that path variable in VCL, you need to bump it up to VCL 4.1. So those are the biggest changes. Of course, if that were the only changes, it would be relatively disappointing. So there was a lot of stuff that was added, a collection of vmods that was added, like the Unix vmod, of course, to inspect your Unix domain socket. There's a proxy vmod. I think I have a slide on that as well, where you can detect whether or not the proxy protocol was used and hence determine whether or not TLS was used. This works excellent if you use Hitch, an open source TLS terminator that we've built ourselves. So this is great to figure out, is it TLS or is it a regular HTTP connection? And then a bunch of other stuff like certain TTL variables at the request side, grace variables. You could trigger errors from VCL now. One I was involved in that I used a bit of politics to get that in is in recent versions of Varnish 6, there is a module called cookie that allows you to easily access cookies, and you no longer need to use the very dirty regular expression syntax. And I can go on. There's a long list of features. One I would like to highlight before we go to the next part is that you're no longer forced to explicitly define a backend. You can use a none backend and do the rest synthetically. So yes, a lot of change, but most of it is compatible. But the main thing, which I showed you here, is that the path property of the backend definition is not compatible with older versions. That was quite a handful, right?
It was, but it's very good to kind of really highlight those changes. Another thing, kind of as we are in the beginning of the book, and something that I wanted to bring up, it came up as a question as well. The book deals with both Varnish Cache and Varnish Enterprise, so our open source version and our enterprise version. So I guess the question is kind of, what are the differences? How does the book handle both of those? Because it does go into both. And the actual question that we got was, is it easy to upgrade from cache to enterprise, and are they compatible?
They are, and it's, well, I wouldn't call it controversial, but it would be easy for me to write a book about Varnish Enterprise and just being like a sort of commercial pitch on why you need to buy it. I didn't do that because in my title, there's nowhere near any reference to sales. I don't have a sales target. I just talk about technology. So the approach was to write about the Varnish technology, and it happens to be open source and enterprise. And I made a comparison, and in chapter 2, you can do comparison, so I'll take you there. Varnish Cache, of course, as you know, is free and open source software and is managed by the community. Whereas Varnish Enterprise is commercial, it's proprietary, but here's the important bit, it's built on top of Varnish Cache. So in terms of upgrade, there's a 100% compatibility because you're actually dealing with Varnish Cache that has been modified. So we added stuff and made stuff more stable. And we, of course, added a ton of extra features. But I guess a reason why people also like Varnish Enterprise, even though they don't need all the features, is the fact that it's supported and has an SLA. Of course, that last aspect I didn't really mention in the book. I talked about features specifically. I think every time we talk about an enterprise feature, I highlight it so that you know as a user. So long story short, Varnish Cache is a project and Varnish Enterprise is a product. That's important to know.
Okay, great. I think then, if we want to keep moving along, we can kind of talk through chapter 3. So as you just mentioned, chapters 1 and 2 are much more of intro, kind of giving the background, but chapters 3 and 4 are where we really start to learn how to use Varnish. So chapter 3, as you see, it's about HTTP. It's about how to operate and control a cache. So can you talk us through a little bit about chapter 3? Yes,
and it's a very important one. It's very near and dear to me. I think I've done more than 100 presentations about Varnish, and my target audience, because I am one myself, is web developers. And I always want to talk about developer empowerment, about how they can create portable web applications. And one of which is that you have to learn the HTTP spec. You have to know why HTTP has all these nice capabilities of caching. So rather than programming it all in Varnish using the VCL language, your first priority should be to get your HTTP headers in order. And I wrote about the cache control header, the legendary cache control header that is used to decide to cache. In this case, and that's a trick question I use in my presentation, this example will cache an object for 86,400 seconds, which is a day, because smax h takes precedence over max h. But you can also decide not to cache. So all of that can be done in your application. As a developer, you can do this yourself, and Varnish will abide. You can even decide using stale while revalidate how long past its life an object should stay in there stale while we're asynchronously revalidating. And there's so much more syntax, like a vary header that allows you to create cache variations for every single object based on, in this case, the language. I also have a little diagram on that. So every now and then, the book will feature diagrams that will explain certain concepts. So in this case, we have English content and Dutch content. I'm a Dutch native speaker, and you happen to be, Alexander, you happen to be English speaking. If we would go both go to the same website and I'm first and the page ends up in cache, you, as someone who probably doesn't speak Dutch, would see Dutch content. So that would be totally unacceptable. And that's why this vary header would allow you to present two versions, an English version and a Dutch version. But all these things are like, I've spent a lot of time working on that chapter, are explained in detail so that you as a developer can leverage this. And one more thing that I wanted to highlight about chapter 3 is the fact that we support conditional requests, which is also a very powerful technique to avoid sending too much data over the wire. So imagine that the server is Varnish and that you request the foo URL. And we just say, okay, here's the content. 1234 is the E tag, which is a sort of fingerprint of the content. In reality, it will be a bit more complicated. And the next time your browser sends it, and by the way, your browser does this automatically, it will send an if none match header with that same value. And then we can decide, has it changed? Has it not changed? And if it hasn't changed, instead of returning the same object, you can just return a bodiless 304 not modified. And that's just one of these optimizations. And this is just a very simple example. I go into much more detail on how you as a developer can write applications in such a way that when revalidating content, the impact is slim to none. So long story short, as a developer, you should learn HTTP. You should learn all the bells and whistles in regards to caching. And if you do so, and if you play your cards right, you will see a tremendous amount of power. You will experience a tremendous amount of power, and the load on your system will reduce heavily. And in the end, you'll have developer empowerment and a portable application.
Perfect. So then, I mean, that's, like you said, chapter 3. But chapter 4 then moves us on into VCL, which is kind of the next, I guess, phase of that. So VCL is obviously very unique, and it is something that is just for Varnish. So this is what chapter 4 is all about. Do you want to take us through chapter 4?
Yeah, so I've been passionately talking about chapter 3 for a couple of minutes now, stating that you as a developer can do it all, and you have developer empowerment, you can take total control, but then reality kicks in, because we need to consider the standard behavior of Varnish as well. Varnish is very cautious when it comes to its behavior, and it will only cache by default, of course, it's the standard behavior, what it thinks is safe to cache. And anything else, out of precaution, it will not cache, and it will be over cautious, which is better than being too aggressive. Imagine that we have a shopping cart on an e-commerce platform that has some sensitive information. If that ends up in the cache, you and I will both see things that are probably not for our eyes. Right. So the reality of it is, and that's a tough one to swallow in the beginning, Varnish will not cache if it sees a cookie. So I would like to ask to the audience, have you ever seen a website that doesn't have cookies? With all the pop-ups, the cookie consent pop-ups that we've seen over the years, the answer is pretty much no. So that would be a big disappointment, saying, okay, so Varnish doesn't support cookies, what do you do? Well, Varnish will be cautious as mentioned, but if you want to diverge from this standard behavior, you can use the Varnish configuration language. And I must admit, like I've looked at various caching solutions throughout the years prior to joining Varnish software. And the most compelling feature and the reason why people like Varnish so much is obviously that configuration language, because you can tune the behavior of Varnish to the exact needs of your application. And we're not talking about a simple config file in which you define some rules. No, we're talking about a full-blown programming language. And it's not a top-down programming language. It's not like you have to write PHP or Python or C. No, it is VCL, and it is a very domain-specific language. It only works in Varnish. And what it does is it doesn't define behavior, it overrides behavior. So I was talking about standard behavior. I'm going to throw in a diagram here. It's all based on this finite state machine. It's like this, I wouldn't call it a maze because it's pretty straightforward, but there is a flow. What you see here is you start at the beginning, you receive a request, then you look that request up in cache via VCL hash. It could be a hit, could be a miss, could be a purge, and then you go through all of this. And that defines the standard behavior. However, at any point, you can override this behavior by extending the name of this routine and doing things with it. So like I was talking about standard behavior and the fact that Varnish is so cautious. Like I have extracts from the standard behavior, things that will happen even if you don't write this code, things that will happen behind the scenes. So here's a very cautious approach. The things I marked in red matter. So if the request method is not a get or a head, probably means it's a post or a put or a patch or a delete, we don't cache. So that's caution. Like if you do a post to submit a form, you're actually changing things. So we don't want to cache that by default. Or if an authorization header is present, meaning you have to log in, or if there's a cookie, we will not cache either. So return pass means don't cache. So that is standard behavior that is defined in VCL receive. At the other end of the spectrum, when something is a cache miss and you receive an update from the backend, here's also some rules. If the TTL that was defined by the backend is equal or less to 0 seconds, we won't cache. If your application tries to set a cookie, it means you're trying to change the state. We don't cache either. If there's a surrogate control or a cache control header that contains no store, or if the cache control header contains no cacher, nor store, nor private, we don't cache either, and so on and so forth. So all of that is standard behavior. But then I need to reach the point I'm trying to make is you can override this behavior. And I've prepared a little bit of a code example here where we use regular expressions to do substitutions in the cookie. So here I am telling you that cookies can be cached, but if you play your cards right, you can use them to your advantage. Imagine that this VCL code is used to modify the caching behavior of a multilingual website, one that allows you to have a language selection on this sort of typical splash page. And once you've selected the language will be stored in the language cookie. And we'll use that throughout the website to present the right language. So what we're doing here is when we receive the request, that's why we're in VCL receive, we check if there's a cookie. And if there's a cookie, we provide all kinds of regular expression magic, which means we will remove everything except that cookie that is marked in red, the language cookie. And if it turns out in the end, by substituting everything, there was no language cookie, but just a collection of empty strings, we'll strip them off. And if it turns out we do have a language cookie, we'll explicitly cache. And that's interesting, but we can't cache it normally. We also need to make variation so that the homepage is available, in this case, in Dutch, in English, and in French. So we provide all this very cool code to do things that aren't possible using standard HTTP. And that is the message. And this book is called Varnish 6 by example. And there's a reason for that, because I guess there's almost 200 examples in this book. A lot of them are VCL examples. And this should be the reason why you read this book.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the examples and kind of the tips and tricks throughout are really what is valuable about this book. So perfect. And then I think, obviously talking about how powerful VCL is and what you can really do with it. That being said, you can't do everything. So kind of
that's true.
Yeah. So what is the solution here? And that kind of takes us into chapter 5. Well, the solution is vmods.
Yeah, of course. So in early days of Varnish, whatever you couldn't do in VCL, we provided a really ugly, dangerous, shoot yourself in the foot solution through inline C, because you may not know this, the VCL language, when you start Varnish, or whatever you wrote in your VCL file, gets transpiled into C, and the C code gets compiled into a shared object, and that gets linked to the Varnish runtime process. And that's what makes it so fast, because in the end, it's just C compiled into machine code. So if you provide a sort of gateway to the end user to write C, well, I'm not good at C. I guess a lot of people in here are maybe okay in C, but not experts. You'll shoot yourself in the foot and the thing will crash and burn. So eventually, the developers of Varnish said, instead of providing them with an interface to write C, why don't we define an API in which you can write modules? And we will provide a rich ecosystem. And if you need some custom ones, you can develop them. And that's how this very rich ecosystem of modules started appearing. And they extend the VCL language. So they're written in C. So if you don't care about C, don't just use them. You can import them in your code. And all of a sudden, your VCL language has extra capabilities. And Varnish Cache has them as well. Like if you look at Varnish 6, these are the modules that are shipped. We have a blob module, which blob is short for binary large object. I haven't used it ever, but it's there. The cookie vmod is also there in recent versions of Varnish. Directors have been there since the old days and are there for load balancing. I'm a big fan of the proxy vmod, which I already featured a couple of minutes ago. There's an extra vmod to offer extra capabilities to content invalidation. And I think those of you who have used Varnish will be familiar with the standard vmod that has a sort of toolbox of random functionality. Unix is there to inspect permissions of a Unix domain socket. And VTC is something that under normal circumstances in an operational environment you will not use, because VTC is short for Varnish test case. And these are utility functions that you can use when testing Varnish using our functional testing suite. So that is shipped in the free version. And again, this is the example that I previously featured, that by importing proxy, all of a sudden you have a namespace called proxy with a collection of extra functions. And the same applies to everything else. But then, of course, that's where we get into the commercial side of things. We, of course, develop modules ourselves. That's our bread and butter. So this is a long list, and it's not a complete list even, of things that we add on top of Varnish Enterprise to provide that value. Now, chapter 5 is where you'll find this. We talk about Varnish cache vmods, Varnish Enterprise vmods, and there's also some third-party vmods. And if I look at the list of attendees, there's even someone in the audience who wrote one of those vmods that I featured. It's Carlos. Carlos is also in the chat. Hi, Carlos. Glad to have you here. He's responsible for the Redis one. So he developed this by himself. This is not associated directly with us, Varnish Enterprise, or the open source community. And it's one of those use cases that I tend to like and therefore advocate.
Fantastic. Glad Carlos is with us today. Perfect. So then, talking about vmods, talking about everything else, moving into chapter 6 is where we kind of talk a little bit about how to cache. Prior to this, talk about how to cache everything, but can you cache too much? So chapter 6, obviously about invalidating the cache. And one of the questions that we had come up was, what are some examples of when I would want to invalidate cache?
Well, I'm going to use the most typical example I can, and that comes from media. And the reason why I say that media websites are so typical is because it is the origin use case. I'm not sure if everyone knows this, but Varnish hasn't always been open source. It initially started as a sort of tailor-made consultancy project for a Norwegian newspaper. So there's this Norwegian newspaper. To this day, they still use Varnish, of course. And they're called Verdensgang, or their website is vg.no. And they needed a way to accelerate the website because it was so popular. And they contacted a Scandinavian consultancy company called Red Pill Linpro and asked them for a solution. Red Pill Linpro talked to Paul Henning Kamp, which was an independent a core contributor of FreeBSD and a very, very intelligent man. And they came up with a solution. And it was such a popular solution that it was decided to call it Varnish and to open source it. And eventually, after a number of years, our company, Varnish Software, actually spun out of Red Pill Linpro. So that's why media is so relevant and online newspapers are so relevant. So let me get back, after this long tangent, let me get back to the point, is imagine you have content on the homepage of your website. It's cached heavily, very aggressively, and the performance is excellent. And all of a sudden, you have this breaking news item that changes everything. And then you're stuck with cache. And then the question is, like, how do you deal with this? I mean, there's breaking news that is some catastrophic news, and you can't see it on the website because the page is in cache. Do you accept that? No. So caching too long? Yes. Should we set the TTL lower to ensure that the waiting times are less? Well, no, not really, because then you'll have a performance impact. So the actual solution is remove content from the cache explicitly, regardless of the TTL, and trigger this from your content management suite. So when something changes on your news website, make sure your CMS is connected to the invalidation logic of Varnish. So when you press publish on that breaking news article, it actually breaks the news. The breaking news is actually breaking. And that is what this entire chapter is about. And I must admit, as a longtime Varnish user, I believe the Varnish invalidation logic and all the capabilities it has are second to none. Because otherwise, why dedicate a full chapter to it? And I have a code example for those who care. Like you'll find this exact example in the book, where we write some VCL deliberately to invalidate one item from the cache or multiple items. And I marked the functionality in red that actually triggers this. So if you provide a pattern, you will call the ban function, which does pattern-based invalidation, meaning you can, like with a single call, invalidate 1,000,000 pages. Or if you don't, you can invalidate the very page you're accessing. Now, this may look like gibberish to some of you, but like in terms of HTTP, you can just call the homepage, which you see here. This is a raw HTTP request. And instead of doing a get, which you usually do a purge. And if you provide an invalidation pattern, that pattern is the regular expression URL that is used. So in this case, imagine that the breaking news is that there's news in the sports category. So every page using this call in the sports category will be invalidated. If, of course, you only care about the homepage of the sports category, then you don't need to provide the pattern. And the URL of /sports is good enough to remove the sports page from cache. And then afterwards, people will start going to the sports page and we'll see the updated content. And this is just one example, but there's plenty of examples based on URLs, based on secondary keys, tag-based invalidation, doing it via HTTP, doing it via the Varnish ADM command line interface, tons of stuff, a full chapter.
Perfect. Thank you. I think that was a great example of why you would want to invalidate the cache. So perfect. And then, yeah, let's move on to chapter 7. One of the things you talked about in the very beginning is a lot of the new focuses and the new chapters in this book. And chapter 7 is obviously one of them, Varnish for operations, and operating Varnish at scale. And some of the features that you would use to do this, TLS, MSE, high availability, all of these features are kind of something that we talk about in chapter 7. So I know this is also a really big chapter in the book. So I'll give you some time to kind of talk us through this because I do think it's an important one in there.
Yes, definitely. And please interrupt me, Alexandra, when I'm rambling too much about this, because this is by far the biggest chapter. So I took count before I started this webinar, and the chapter 7, which is the operational chapter, is 288 pages long. Knowing that the book is 778 pages, that's quite a chunk. But it's important. And I mean, I am a developer at heart, and my favorite audience, of course, is the web developer audience because they need it the most. But in the end, I've worked at a hosting company for 15 years, and these are the people that need to manage Varnish. Like, we can talk about DevOps and empathy and tearing down silos and working together, but in the end, there's an ops person who is responsible for keeping that thing up. And there's a surprising amount of things you need to do to ensure that stability. And I'm going to show you the chapter breakdown here so that you know what we're talking about. So these are the different sections of chapter 7. So of course, I'll explain where you can install Varnish, how to configure it, or all the runtime parameters you can tune. One is TLS. It's been controversial for years now. Why doesn't Varnish have native TLS? Well, that's not really true as of a couple of years, because now Varnish Enterprise provides native TLS, which is explained in that section. But also, if you're using open source, how can you efficiently terminate TLS? How can you assure yourself that requests are HTTP or HTTPS and that kind of stuff? So a lot of in-depth stuff about TLS. And I must admit, a bunch of things that you'll read in this chapter are very Varnish Enterprise driven. Not because I wanted to pitch Varnish Enterprise, but because they're relevant. Like, storage is a big aspect. Like, I want to store as much as possible in the cache. How do I approach this? How do I deal with memory? Is there a way to use disk-based storage? And I talked about massive storage there as the perfect solution for that. Load balancing was not enterprisey. It uses everything in cache. How do you deal with multiple backends? How do you deal with a multi-tier Varnish environment where one layer of Varnish servers will start routing traffic to other layers of Varnish? And why is that relevant? It's also explained there. High availability is a sensitive subject. Like, you're sitting on a stack of multiple Varnish servers, sitting behind a load balancer. How do you ensure that the next request that might randomly go onto another server, that you're not dealing with a cache miss, knowing that this object is already in another server? That's the entire high availability suite. Is a bit more enterprise driven. But the key things, in my opinion, and I think I wrote most about them, is monitoring and logging. And these are some key capabilities of Varnish, both open source and enterprise. Like you run this, you've been through all these chapters. So you know how to use HTTP, you know how to write VCL, you've used some VMODs, you invalidated the cache, it's up and running. How do you know you're successful? Well, monitoring and logging is one of those. Like monitoring will assure that you get the right statistics and metrics. And you can use tools like Prometheus to actually integrate that into a dashboard or trigger alerts, all that kind of stuff. And when things do go wrong or aren't very clear, you can use our very, very verbose logging suite to actually drill down and look for what's happening. So that's what it's also about. I also talk about security, which is always a hot topic from an operational perspective. So that was an easy one to just mention that one. And also about tuning. So you have your Varnish up and running with the default settings. How do I get most out of it? What counters of the monitoring do I need to monitor? And if those are bent out of shape, which parameters do I tune to make it better? And then of course, some admin stuff that you can do with the command line interface. All of that is there.
Perfect. One of the questions that did come up regarding this chapter is really, where can I run Varnish? So can you talk a little bit about Varnish on-prem versus the cloud?
Yeah, I can. We provide official packages for Varnish. And I'm specifically referring to open source, because if you're an enterprise client, of course, you'll have packages. But the community is in charge of releasing the new versions. So as mentioned earlier, twice a year, March 15th, September 15th, you'll have that brand new Varnish version. It is good software. It is relatively stable, but it's not an LTS version. And as a company, that's our community contribution as well, is we maintain Varnish 6.0 LTS. And that's what this entire book is based on in essence. So we provide packages for that are available, that we advocate for Ubuntu, Debian, Red Hat, CentOS, you name it. So that is available. And that is very much an on-prem thing, but it could be a cloud thing if you want. If you care about building your own machine images in the cloud, you can use our packages to do so. Now, mind you, these packages also support fresh versions, as we call them. So if you don't care about LTS and you just want the brand spanking new versions of Varnish, well, you can install them via packages as well. Now, what I've seen in the industry that changed and where a lot of demand was is container software, of course. Like Docker is all over the place. I remember where every time you read something about IT, it was Docker, 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 Docker. Of course, we had to make sure we're involved in that. And we have an official Docker image readily available. Quite recently, I was also involved in that. We released an official Hitch Docker image, which is our TLS software. It's perfectly compatible. So you can spin up a Hitch instance to do very high performance TLS termination and connect it to Varnish. We're working on some Kubernetes stuff, like some Helm charts, but those aren't ready yet. So I hinted towards those, but I also showed you how to manually use the Docker image on Kubernetes. And then in the end, I talked about cloud. And if we ever can travel again, and if I can ever speak at a physical event again, and if you ever see me there talking about Varnish, at the end of the presentation, I will always talk about the cloud images, because that's a really cool thing. So we're available on, let me take you to the list. We're on AWS, we're on Azure, we're on Google Cloud, we're on Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, we're on Alibaba Cloud, and we are on DigitalOcean. Now, on the majority of these platforms, we provide a Varnish enterprise image. And you say, well, that's very commercial of you. That might be the case, but we've noticed that the majority of Varnish users just install Varnish through packages. What we did want to provide was a real easy and cheap way to allow you to play around with Varnish Enterprise and the technology specifically, which is what I care about, without having to buy a license up front. And I even advocated, and we have that already in AWS, a developer edition, which is a lot cheaper, but restricts you to smaller images. And that way, if you have the book and if you just want to play around without spending money on a license, you can do so in the cloud. That's because all these cloud platforms have a marketplace and they establish a relation with you as an end user. So you pay by the hour, and these are small fees by the hour, but you don't pay them to us. You pay them to Amazon or Google or Azure, with which you already have a relationship. So that's the reason why, because these marketplaces exist, that we were able to do so. But on DigitalOcean right now and on Alibaba Cloud, there is no such thing. So we did the next best thing and just provide Varnish cache images to play around with. And I will be creating some content on DigitalOcean very soon. So that should be the answer, the very long answer to your question, why or where can you run Varnish? Yes, on-prem, yes, in the cloud, yes, using container technology.
Perfect. All right, so we have 2 more chapters to get through.
Well, I see that we have a question from the audience. I see
we
that.
Do. Yes.
Yeah, that Simon Hellström asked the question, what is your biggest tips about VCL to an IT student like me? Well, Simon or Simon or whatever you want me to pronounce your name, my biggest advice to you is write as little VCL code as possible. Which brings me back to chapter 3. Try to do as much using HTTP as possible and do the absolute minimum in VCL. Because the more VCL you write, the more VCL you need to maintain and the more complicated things get. So do as much as possible in HTTP and only when you need to write snippets of VCL to extend the standard behavior. I'm not sure if I just gave you a load more confusion or if I actually answered your question, but that's the one. And I think if we look at it very pragmatically, the VCL you write will most probably revolve around cookie behavior and how to cache certain cookies or not cache when other cookies are present. So look into the cookie section. If you've downloaded my book, Simon, look at chapter 4 about VCL. There is a subsection called Making Changes. And that's where I give very concrete examples on how to override the standard behavior using VCL. The rest of the chapter leads up to that and teaches you the syntax of VCL and how you can extend behavior. And it gets applied at the end in the section called Making Changes. So I really hope that answered your question.
Perfect. All right. So chapter 8, again, is another kind of new focus. In chapter 8, we talk about decision making at the edge. So more specifically, if we want to talk about it, a term, or I guess a phrase that I think use a lot internally is caching the uncacheable. So
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what this means and what we kind of go through in chapter 8?
Definitely. So I've been working with Varnish for a long time, and usually the thing I focused on when writing VCL was try to cache as much as possible and provide rules and logic to deal with things that aren't cacheable. And that was always the trade-off. I call it a take it or leave it kind of decision-making style. But in the end, there's a lot more you can do with Varnish. And the focus of this chapter is, instead of saying, okay, we need to write rules to not cache this, you can ask yourself the question, is there a way for me to take these decisions that are made inside the application in Varnish, and basically dealing with the stateful information? And I'll show you the chapter breakdown so that you know. So we talked about cookies extensively throughout the book and why it's difficult and ways to circumvent them and ways to cache cookies. But sometimes you can use cookies to identify logic that is stored elsewhere, like in an external service. And the third section here is about HTTP calls. So you can actually, using one of our modules, do an HTTP call to a third-party endpoint, inspect the output, maybe parse the JSON, and then make decisions based on the cookie that you get, maybe a session cookie, if certain things should happen. Now, you can also replace the idea of HTTP calls with database access. You can access a SQLite database if you want to using Varnish. You can talk to Memcached. Of course, you could talk to Redis. I already talked about that, and the fact that Carlos, who is here just today, wrote an excellent VMod for that. So all of that is mentioned in there. I talk about the fact that Varnish Enterprise offers geo features that allows you to have a look at your user and identify him globally and either geo-fence him or use his geographical location to present the right content. And a lot of it is done using synthetic responses. And I think I have a little example on that, which I'll show you now. So what I've done here, and as it happens, I'm using the Redis VMod in this very example. So I'm importing a collection of modules and I'm initializing Redis. So what I've done here, and it comes from a proof of concept I built about e-commerce, is built this Varnish wall around an e-commerce platform that is a bit too prone to heavy load, and we try to take that away. So what happens is that this is written in PHP. This happens to be the language I like. So if you don't like it, my apologies. And it stores its sessions in Redis. So the session information, in this case, also the shopping cart information, is stored in that session, and that happens to be in Redis. So instead of saying we can't cache this page because it's too personalized, it shows the items that you have in your shopping cart or the number of items. Well, we can make the decision ourselves and say, we'll cache this and we'll fetch the number of shopping cart items for your session out of Redis ourselves, and we'll cache it. And we know that Redis is super fast, and we can use all kinds of caching tricks to do so. So what I'm doing here is using a cookie module to remove every single cookie except the PHP session ID cookie, which has the session ID of the user who added something to the cart. If the user tries to add an item to the cart or tries to remove an item from the cart, we won't cache that. That's a decision we will not make. But for this really simple proof of concept, if you're accessing the home page, regardless of cookies, we will cache. And then in the next section, when we receive a response from the cache for the home page, what we're doing here is some advanced stuff. xbody.regsub, you see on that slide, what it does is it substitutes responses received from the origin. So all of a sudden, we're not just receiving objects from the backend server, we're changing them. And we're replacing, but I have a nice slide to make this perfectly comprehensible in just a minute. What we're doing is looking for an HTML item or sort of tag called span. And the idea of that span HTML tag is items in cart. And it probably has like a number, which is the number of items it has in the cart. And we will replace it with find and replace magic into a placeholder, and we'll cache that template. And then right before we deliver the content, we will access the session mechanism and count the number of items for that session that is stored in Redis and parse it in there. So that's quite advanced stuff, like super advanced. And I love it from an e-commerce perspective. So whenever I talk about edge side decision making from an e-commerce perspective, I usually go along the lines of this. Now, I understand and fully realize that this may sound like gibberish to you. So here's a diagram on what happens. So on top, you see that span item, that HTML item that came from the origin that says there's 5 items in Alexander's shopping cart. He's been busy shopping, there's 5 items in there. But we don't want to cache this because this is highly personalized. So what we do is we replace it with a mustache placeholder. And for those of you who are web developers here, mustache, very popular templating system that uses these curly braces as a sort of handlebar syntax. And what we do is we turn it into items in cart, and we cache that because that's the template. And we're sure we can cache this. And every time we deliver content, we look at the cookie, we identify the session ID, we look up that session from Redis, and then we get the actual value. And because it's you, Alex, you will see 5 items in cart. If I tend to go there, I will see 2. But all these decisions aren't made at the origin. They are made on the edge. And that is what makes it so powerful. And that's the entire idea, like make more decisions on the edge. Don't settle for, oh, we won't cache this, because these non-cacheable routes will still be a major attack vector on your origin under certain circumstances. That's by far one of the most advanced chapters in the book, but it's super cool if you want to.
Yeah, I would agree with that one. All right, so then I want to get us into the last chapter, chapter 9, and then have a couple of minutes at the end for some other questions that have come in. But that being said, chapter 9 kind of culminates everything from the book. It really talks about building your own CDN with Varnish. I know that you yourself have done several webinars in several different languages about this very topic. So around that, can you talk a little bit about chapter 9, why it's such a big chapter, why it kind of takes everything else from the book to kind of allow you to do this, and why, I guess we could say in very timely manner, this would be something that people would maybe want to look into doing?
Yes, and I noticed that there's not a whole lot of content out there in the wild about building CDNs using Varnish, whereas people should know that plenty of CDNs out there are built using Varnish. And it actually took me it took me a couple of months as an employee of Varnish software to fully appreciate that fact. Like, I think in the past, I always referred to Varnish as a web accelerator. And in essence, if you install Varnish on your server, you will accelerate your web application. But you can build such an architecture that in the end, you have a local CDN, multi-pop CDN, if you will. And this is just the culmination of everything. Now, even though it's the culmination of all the previous chapters, this is not such a technical chapter from a Varnish perspective. This talks mostly about architecture and about how you can organize your Varnish servers in such a way that you actually build your own CDN. So what I have here is an image that was also part of the book. You'll find it in chapter 9, and it talks about using a multi-tier Varnish setup. So this is just a single POP, or a point of presence, as we call it. A point of presence is like a set of Varnish servers that is hosted at a specific geographical location. And what we usually do is use 2 tiers of Varnish. And that shows you why this chapter is more about architecture than about learning Varnish. Because if you read chapter 9, or if you're at chapter 9, I'm assuming you already went to the other, so you're educated by then. But what you need to know is that, like, when the client connects to an endpoint and a request router sends you to a specific POP, like I'm in Belgium, so probably I'll end up at the Brussels POP. This might be the Brussels POP. It'll have a collection of edge nodes. These are nodes that are memory driven and whose main priority is to cache hot data, things that are super popular, and are responsible for routing the other content to the storage nodes. And what they usually will do is use a shard-based load balancing strategy to assure that every piece of content is always stored at the same server. So that means the home page might always be stored on storage node 1, and the contact page might always be stored on node 2. And by using the sharding and this consistent hashing technology, you can scale your storage horizontally. So even if you're using open source and you're not using our proprietary massive storage engine, which I also learned to appreciate, you can do this with open source. As long as you have enough memory in those nodes, and you could easily scale your nodes horizontally. Just add nodes, and every piece of content will only be hosted there once. And the edge nodes will be responsible for routing, and the storage nodes will be responsible for ensuring that everything is stored in cache. And it's perfectly fine that the edge nodes only have like a 60% hit rate. We don't really care about that. It's not always about how good your hit rate is. It's how good the misses are. And the misses are fantastic because the storage nodes are Varnish as well. So that is one of these things that we discuss in detail in the book. I also talk about how to deal with multiple points of presence and what routing tools you could use. I think the most common one I address is DNS-based load balancing and what have you. But what is also very specific about this chapter is I talk about other use cases that are diverge from the typical web acceleration. In this chapter, I dedicate a lot of time and a lot of pages to video as well. And that's a big surprise, I guess, to a lot of people, that Varnish is excellent for OTT video streaming, which is a huge use case. And I've learned that when I joined the company, that the majority of our clientele uses Varnish for building their own CDNs, and that a surprising amount, names that will not be mentioned because of contractual reasons, but I'm pretty sure all of you will know them, use it to accelerate like full video platforms. And that caught me off guard. I was like amazed. And in the end, it's just HTTP. Like OTT video is just HTTP. And you just need to tune your Varnish nodes correctly and write the right VCL, and you can host a full-blown CDN. And with the advent of 5G, I didn't write too much about it. I hinted towards it. I think if we talk about making decisions on the edge, it's perfectly in sync with the philosophy of 5G, that there's a lot still to come, and that a lot of like localized CDNs will be built around 5G antennas and their backbone. So yeah, more strategy and architecture than actual code in this chapter.
Yeah, but again, I think this one really kind of wraps up the book as a whole, because like you mentioned, it is our primary use case for a lot of users is this CDN.
It has become that, and that is because the internet has evolved as well. There's a need for this, obviously, and I didn't know that earlier on in my career, but I fully appreciate that now. I see that we have some questions, both in the chat as in the Q&A.
Yes, we have just a couple of minutes. So I do want to make sure that we get to some of these. We did have some, that were also asked prior. One of them you did hint at, but if you can just remind us again, when or where can I find a hard copy? I know you talked about this in the very beginning.
Yeah, there is no hard copy yet. So yesterday I gave the okay to have it printed. So I'm assuming that email was received and the people responsible for this are processing this now, but this will probably take some lead time. So I guess I already have my ISBN number. So this is not just something that we done at home and then just printed ourselves. It has an actual ISBN number. So it will be published. And I guess, and that's an assumption, is that it will be on Amazon and other online bookstores. So you'll be able to buy it there. But it'll take us, and it'll take the editing company a couple of weeks, I guess. But
it's
Alex,
coming.
I'm sure you as a marketeer, you'll make some noise on social media and on our newsletter, I guess. So if you're interested in a hard copy, you'll be able to purchase it online. And if the world allows travel again and we do physical events, I will be there at my events handing out free.
Perfect. And then, yes, like you said, we had a couple other questions come in.
So I will start with the one in the chat. So Konstantin asked, is anything in the book about ESI? If not, why? Yes, of course. ESI is short for Edge Side Includes. And as it happens, earlier this afternoon, I recorded a video about it for this weekly video section that we provide. It's called 2-Minute Tech Tuesdays. Next Tuesday's version is about ESI. So if you're interested, have a look at that. So long story short, ESI is short for Edge Side Includes. It's a sort of placeholder syntax that web developers can use to trigger Varnish to load these placeholders. So that means if you have this typical layout where you have like a shopping cart, for example, an example that we touched on earlier, you can decide to load that one separately and not cache it. So yes, there's plenty of ESI in the book in chapter 4. And we talk about like an iteration of that called Edge Stash also in chapter 8, but it's definitely there. It's quite prominent, and you'll see code examples on how to use ESI in the most efficient way. So Konstantin, I hope that answers your question. Then we have another one.
Perfect.
In the actual Q&A section by Masoud. He says that they're an IPTV provider and using Varnish open source as CDN, but we had lots of issues with caching on storage. And now we're using malloc. Is there any way to use disk-based cache? Well, Masoud, the answer is sort of yes, but we strongly advise against it. So in the open source, there is a module called vmod. There is a module called, or a stevedore, or a storage engine called file. So you can actually store it on disk. It's part of open source, but it has been out there for a while. And what we've noticed from our clientele early on, even prior to our organization existing, is that a lot of disk fragmentation occurs over time. So it's not the most efficient. And on top of that, it's not persistent either. So if you restart your system, you'll lose the cache. That's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue remains the disk fragmentation. So if we look at the history of Varnish software, the very first proprietary feature that we wrote in Varnish Enterprise was actually a way to tackle this. And that is called Massive Storage Engine. So I'm not saying you should buy Varnish Enterprise, because again, I'm not a commercial person, but definitely look at it. Look at chapter 7, the MSE subsection. We've made a business out of it, Masoud. So it is so important for us. And we see a lot of people in your industry with the same challenges. And that is the main reason why people buy Varnish Enterprise. So unfortunately, I don't have anything solid in the open source, but I do have something super solid in Enterprise. So either you're happy with the answer or you're disappointed that it's not in the open source.
Yes. So I think we have one more question that we can go through. And actually, there's two questions that are somewhat related. So can Varnish Cloud be used in my intranet sites? Some sites made in plain HTML and others in Drupal. And then the second question that kind of goes along with that, are there any special considerations for using Varnish with Drupal?
Yeah, Drupal is very popular. It's one of those top 2 CMSs out there, and we definitely have capabilities for that. As a matter of fact, we have online resources on how to tune Drupal and Varnish. But this is one of my big projects I'm working on right now, is building a platform where this information will be available. So if you're interested, drop us an email and we'll send you the right resources on Drupal. But it's definitely possible. And both from a community perspective, as from our perspective, we're invested in this, and we gave some advice to the Drupal community on how to best tune Drupal for Varnish. And we did that by providing a VCL and also by providing input on an official Drupal capability on how to empty the cache, because I explained that breaking news and such. So if you update something in Drupal, there are ways to invalidate the cache automatically. And that's part of the native behavior of Drupal. So we contribute to that. But the question was more complicated than that. The question was, yeah, we have an intranet site that combines plain text HTML and Drupal. And the answer is yes, you can do that perfectly. You can either provide the rules inside a single VCL file, so like mix it all together. But unfortunately, after a while, that will get complicated and you'll lose track of things and it will be more difficult to maintain. So what you can do is like separate them and have multiple VCL files. And Varnish 6 supports VCL labels, which allows you to match the host name or the URL pattern and then load the VCL file accordingly. So that will ensure that from an organizational point of view, it will be easier to maintain. Does that answer it, or do we need to elaborate more on that?
I think that answers it. And unfortunately, we are running a few minutes over. So I do want to make sure that we give everyone their time back today. If we did not get to your question, we will follow up with you offline. So feel free, though, if you do have any questions, shoot us an email, info@varnishsoftware.com. If you have not yet, you can download the book for free on our website. And thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Thijs, for that. Was a great insight into the entire book. And we, like I said, this will be sent out to everyone after, so you can refresh your memory on any questions. And that's all that we have for today.
Thank you, everyone.
So thank you, everyone.
You for taking that time out of your busy schedule to be here with us. I hope it was worth your while, and I hope it was like a sort of you got the cheat codes to use the book.
Perfect. Thank you all. Have a great one.